Most countries are young. Some are powerful. A handful are ancient. But China is something else entirely. It doesn't think like a nation. It doesn't act like one. When the world tries to apply rules that work everywhere else, China just doesn't fit. Because China isn't a country pretending to be a civilization. It's a civilization pretending to be a country. For 200 years, the West has been asking the same question about China over and over. When will it become like us? When will it adopt democracy? When will it liberalize? When will it finally think like a modern nation? And every decade, China gives the same answer. No. Not because it's stubborn. Not because it's backwards. But because the question itself doesn't make sense to China. It's like asking a tree when it will start swimming. The tree isn't refusing to swim. It's just not a fish. So what is China actually? If it's not just another country on the map, let's start with what most of us understand as normal. A nation. Most countries today are nation-states. France, Germany, Brazil, Nigeria, Japan. They were all born in the last few hundred years. Some even younger than that. They have borders, passports, laws that clearly define who's in and who's out. Political legitimacy comes from some version of consent. Maybe it's elections, maybe it's a constitution, maybe it's both. But the underlying idea is the same. The people, in theory, agree to be governed by this particular system. This model was invented in Europe after the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. It spread everywhere, became the default setting for what a country is supposed to look like. The assumption became universal. If you want to be a legitimate state, you need borders, a flag, a government, and ideally some form of democratic process. That's how the modern world was built. Now, here's China. China wasn't born 300 years ago. It's been around in some recognizable form for over 2,000 years. The borders have moved. Dynasties have changed. Names have shifted. Rulers have come and gone. But the core identity, the sense of being China, that stayed. Political scientist Martin Jacques, in his book When China Rules the World, calls China not a nation trying to act civilized, an actual civilization that got squeezed into the shape of a modern country because the international system told it to. What's the difference between a nation-state and a civilization state? A nation-state is defined by borders and laws. Its legitimacy comes from institutions. A civilization state is defined by culture, continuity, and collective memory. Its legitimacy comes from history. A nation-state thinks in election cycles. For years, maybe 8. A civilization state thinks in centuries, sometimes millennia. When Zhou Enlai, the Chinese premier, was asked in the 1970s what he thought about the French Revolution of 1789, he supposedly said, "It's too soon to say." That's not a joke. That's the time scale China operates on. The nation-state model assumes history is background noise, something that happened before the real story began. Civilization states treat history like an operating system. You don't rewrite it. You run on Italiano, you update Italiano, but you never delete it. Why China looks like a country today? So if China is this ancient civilization, why does it look like a country now? Simple answer, it had no choice. In the 1800s, the world was run by European empires. Those empires didn't care about civilizations. They cared about borders, treaties, sovereignty, and gunboats. When Britain showed up with warships during the Opium Wars, China couldn't say, "We're a civilization, not a country, so your rules don't apply to us." The West didn't care. They wanted trade agreements. They wanted territorial concessions. They wanted China to fit into the international system they had built. So China adapted. It put on the costume, drew borders, signed treaties, joined the United Nations, started calling itself the People's Republic of China. It learned to speak the language of sovereignty and statehood. It participated in the global system. But inside, it never stopped being a civilization. Chinese scholar Zhang Weiwei describes China as a civilization. He argues that China is unique because it's the only place on Earth where an ancient civilization and a modern state exist in the same body. Europe had many civilizations. Greece, Rome, the Celts, the Germanic tribes, but none of them survived as unified political entities. They fragmented. They became France, Germany, Italy, Spain, dozens of separate countries. China went the opposite direction. It started as many small kingdoms during the Warring States period. Slowly, over thousands of years, it fused into one. That fusion, it's still holding. What makes China a civilization state So what actually makes China a civilization state, instead of just a really old country? 3 things: continuous written language, dynastic cycles, and bureaucracy. Let's break them down. Number 1. Continuous written language. China has used the same family of written script for over 2,000 years. A person in China today can pick up a text written during the Han Dynasty, around 200 BCE, and read it. Not perfectly, not easily. The grammar is strange. The vocabulary is archaic, but the script itself, still recognizable, still readable. Compare that to Europe. Try reading Old English from 1,000 years ago. You can't. It looks like a completely different language. Because it basically is, English from 1000 CE is incomprehensible to a modern English speaker without serious study. This continuity matters enormously. It means the past isn't mythical in China. It's accessible. It's present. The ideas of Confucius, who lived 2,500 years ago, aren't ancient history locked away in academic texts. They're part of the living cultural code that people still reference, still debate, still use to justify political decisions today. When a Chinese leader talks about harmony, unity, or the importance of social order, they're not inventing new ideas. They're pulling from a philosophical and cultural script that's been running for millennia. History isn't something you study in China. It's something you live inside. It's not background. It's foundation. Number 2. Dynastic cycles. This is something Westerners find deeply strange. China expects to collapse. Not permanently, but regularly. This is the concept of the dynastic cycle. A dynasty rises. It rules. Well, it brings prosperity. Then it gets corrupt. It loses legitimacy. It falls. A new dynasty takes over. The cycle repeats. This pattern played out for over 2,000 years. The Han Dynasty, the Temps, the Song, the Ming, the Qing. All of them rose. All of them fell. But here's the key. The collapse of a dynasty was never seen as the end of China. It was seen as temporary disorder, a bad chapter. Not the end of the story. The empire might fracture into warlord states for decades, but reunification was always the goal. Always the expectation. Unity wasn't a hope, it was destiny. This is tied to an idea called the mandate of heaven. It's not a religious concept in the Western sense. It's political philosophy. The ruler has legitimacy, as long as they maintain order, serve the people, and keep the civilization stable. If disasters, strife, floods, famines, rebellions, if corruption spreads, if chaos breaks out, it's a sign that heaven has withdrawn the mandate. At that point, rebellion becomes justified, not because people want freedom or democracy, but because the system has broken down and needs to be restored. The goal isn't to build something new, it's to fix what's broken and return to harmony. That mentality is still deeply embedded in Chinese politics today. The Chinese Communist Party doesn't justify its rule by saying, "We won an election." It justifies its rule by saying, "We restored order after a century of chaos and humiliation." The message is the same as it was 2,000 years ago. We brought unity. We ended disorder. We have the mandate. If they lose that chief, they fail to maintain stability. They know what happens. History has shown them over and over. Number 3. Bureaucracy. For over 1,000 years, China ran on a meritocratic civil service system called the Imperial examination. If you wanted power, you didn't need to be born into the right family. You didn't need noble blood. You needed to pass the exams. These exams were brutal. Multi-day written tests covering Confucian classics, law, poetry, governance, history. Only about 1% of candidates passed at the highest levels. But if you did, you could rise from a peasant village to the emperor's court. Social mobility through education, through merit, through demonstrated competence. This system started in the Sui dynasty around 600 CE. It lasted until 1905. That's over 1,300 years of the same basic system. What did it do? It created a class of educated bureaucrats who were loyal not to a specific king or dynasty, but to the system itself. Emperors came and went, dynasties rose and fell. But the bureaucracy, it endured. It was the permanent backbone of Chinese governance. Even when the Mongols conquered China and founded the Yuan dynasty, they kept the exam system. Why? Because they realized the bureaucracy was what actually ran the country. The rulers mattered less than the system beneath them. That's still true today. The Chinese Communist Party operates like a modern bureaucracy. Membership is earned through education, exams, performance evaluations, years of service. Leaders are selected internally through a process that prioritizes competence and loyalty to the system, not public popularity. It's not a kingdom. It's not a democracy. It's a technocracy built on a 2,000-year-old template. The tension. Country outside, civilization inside. So here's the fundamental tension. On the outside, China looks like a normal country. It is a flag, a seat at the United Nations, embassies around the world, trade agreements, diplomatic relationships. It plays the game of international relations just like everyone else. But on the inside, it operates like a civilization guardian. When China talks about Taiwan, it's not just talking about territory or sovereignty. It's talking about civilizational unity, completeness, wholeness. Taiwan isn't a breakaway province to China. It's a fragment of the whole that needs to be read. The West looks at China's policies and sees authoritarianism, censorship, lack of freedom. China looks at the same policies and sees survival, stability, protection of the civilization. This dual identity is the key to understanding modern China. Outwardly, it speaks the language of sovereignty, international law, diplomacy. Inwardly, it enforces the logic of continuity, unity, civilizational preservation. It's not lying. It's translating. It's operating in two different systems at the same time. Why this matters for understanding China. Once you understand China as a civilization state, a lot of confusing things start to make sense. Why is China so sensitive about fragmentation, about separatism, about anything that threatens unity? Because civilizations that split apart don't survive long enough to argue about political ideology. European civilization, fragmented into nations, it survived, but as separate entities. China believes fragmentation means death, so it'll do almost anything to prevent it. Why does China plan in decades instead of years? Because its reference point isn't the last election or the next administration. Its reference point is the last 2,000 years of dynastic cycles, rises and falls, lessons learned through centuries of governance. Why does China reject Western-style democracy or human rights frameworks? Not necessarily because it thinks they're wrong in principle, but because from China's perspective, those are secondary concerns. The primary concern, the existential concern, is order, stability, and unity. The West asks, is this just? Is this free? Does this respect individual rights? China asks, does this preserve the civilization? Does this maintain stability? Does this prevent chaos? These are not the same question, and neither side is going to convince the other, because they are not even playing the same game. The West operates on the assumption that the highest political value is individual liberty. China operates on the assumption that the highest political value is collective continuity. You can argue about which one is better, but first, you have to understand that they're fundamentally different goals, the cost and the result. Now, let's be completely honest. This model has costs. A civilization state prioritizes order over dissent. It accepts coercion as a legitimate tool of preservation. It suppresses alternate histories that threaten the official narrative. It punishes movements that could lead to fragmentation. If you're someone who values individual rights, freedom of expression, or political pluralism, the civilization state model is not going to appeal to you. And that's a fair criticism. But the model also produces something the West struggles to create: continuity. China has survived for over 2,000 years as a recognizable entity. It has outlasted empires, invasions, famines, civil wars, revolutions, foreign occupations. And it's still here, still unified, still operating on the same basic cultural and political logic. That's not an accident. It's not luck. It's the result of a system that treats survival and continuity as the highest political values. You can disagree with that prioritization. You can reject it morally, but you can't ignore the results. Because, while the West has been building democracies that last a few centuries, China has been running a civilization that has lasted millennia. China doesn't think like a country. It thinks like a civilization. And until the world understands that distinction, we're going to keep asking the wrong questions and getting surprised by the answers. If this changed how you see Chinese politics and history, hit that like button and subscribe to Access Lens for stories that reveal how power and civilizations actually work.